Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today we are breaking down the 2025 federal budget. My name is Leisa Rafter, and I'm a tax partner at BDO. It's great to be your host today. We begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we work, which here in Brisbane are the Jagera people and Turrbal people. We pay our respects to elders past and present. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us online today. To start, you will see that you are automatically muted. We welcome your questions throughout the session. Please submit these questions using the question tab. If you're having technical problems, click the support button at the bottom of your screen. As is customary, this session is being recorded. You'll get the slides afterwards via email, as well as our contact details and the details for each of the speakers today. Now let me introduce you to our wonderful panel of BDO experts. Anders Magnusson leads the BDO economics team and regularly comments on macroeconomic movements in national media. He is a purpose-driven economist who helps his clients achieve social benefit by leveraging the breadth and depth of expertise at BDO. Denise Brotherington is a Melbourne tax partner with over 30 years of experience advising Australian corporate and multinational businesses, with particular expertise in manufacturing, private equity, life sciences, and agribusiness. James Traynor is a tax partner in Sydney. He has over 20 years' experience providing employment tax services to a range of public, private, and not-for-profit clients. On Tuesday night, Treasurer Jim Chalmers handed down his fourth Australian budget. This budget announced tax cuts, increased access to Medicare bulk billing, and energy bill subsidies. It seeks to provide short-term financial support and cost of living relief. However, there was no mention of much-needed tax reform or long-term tax and economic strategy. There was also no changes to superannuation, so Shirley Schaefer won't be joining us today. I'll now hand over to Anders to discuss the economic detail and outlook.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning, everyone. I'll be providing a quick update on the economic outlook that was in the budget. Then I'll take the economic perspective on the big ticket items in the budget before digging down on a couple of areas, in particular housing and productivity. And I'll share my favorite tasty little morsel that I found towards the end as well. So first with the economic outlook. We're in uncertain times globally, and the Treasurer made a strong point of that in his speech. But it's a good time to be the incumbent government in Australia. Growth is returning, inflation is under control, and unemployment is low and steady. Growth is expected to steadily recover to 2.5% per annum by 26-27. Inflation is expected to stay within the target band for the RBA over the next few years, with a little jump expected due to fiscal policy next year, but still remaining in that band. Unemployment is expected to stabilise at 4.25%. This unemployment, this expectation it's a reduction on previous budget forecasts, and it mirrors the same sort of reduction that the RBA published in February this year. That is interesting because forecasts like this tended to return to about 4.5% unemployment in the past, which was understood to be necessary to keep inflation under control. However, this new expectation of a steady 4.25% means that around 50,000 more jobs can be supported in the economy without causing inflation problems. So that's a good thing socially and for productivity. At the same time, however, that signals a tight labour market, and that could present challenges for finding workers to build the housing and the infrastructure in our investment pipeline. I mentioned uncertainty, and regarding this global uncertainty, the Treasurer's speech described a transition from globalisation to fragmentation, which I think captures it well. But there was a lack of specific action about that uncertainty in the budget. However, that is the global norm right now. It seems that governments are being cautious, but not particularly taking strong action. Just quickly on the budget health, we're expecting 10 years of deficits in the budget, and government debt, because of that, is expected to increase and peak at about 37% in 2029-30. That isn't high by OECD standards, but it's high historically for Australia, and a lot of people were hoping to see a quicker return to surplus and a lower peak in the debt. I'll move on to the big ticket items now. These are the things that have a B behind the number, really, in the budget. And a few things stand out here. Firstly is the tax cuts. That's the biggest one, and James will explain more what this means to individuals later. But what does it mean from an economic perspective if Australians are allowed to keep $17 billion more of their income in their pockets, or to spend as they choose over the next 5 years? Well, the stage 3 tax cuts that we had earlier, they were expected. They were baked into the Reserve Bank's forecasts, and the Reserve Bank had set the cash rate appropriately given that expectation. But these new cuts came as a surprise, and that means that there is a risk that they could cause some unexpected inflation that the current cash rate doesn't consider. I don't think it's a huge problem, but it could potentially slow the decreases in the cash rate as a result. The effect, as I said, will likely be marginal. So on balance, that will still be helpful for the people who do pay personal income tax, because they'll have more cash in their pockets, but potentially unhelpful for those who don't, because they don't get the tax cut, and if there is inflation because of this, then they would be impacted by that. I've heard a range of views from economists as to whether we should worry about this inflationary effect or not, but it isn't exactly unusual for a group of economists to have quite a wide range of views on an issue, and this seems to be one of them, which suggests the effect is likely pretty marginal. Another big ticket item is bulk billing at GPs. So the government's funding an increase in the proportion of GP visits that will be bulk billed up to 90%. That is welcome from a cost of living perspective, but we also need to see improvements in productivity in health, not just delivering more of the same sort of health services that we have currently. And in the last couple of years, most of the jobs created in Australia were in the health sector, and that competes with businesses in the rest of the economy and slows our productivity. So we do need to do better on productivity in the health sector, and it was good to see in the budget funding for 50 additional urgent care clinics, in addition to the 87 already funded, and that will help keep people out of hospital for more minor issues, matching them to a more appropriate and more efficient level of care, which should improve productivity in the system. And the third big ticket that stood out to me was the downgrade in tobacco excise revenue due to the growing supply from the illicit market. The ATO estimates that almost 1/5 of supply now comes from the illicit market because of the high cost of tobacco products. So in response, the government has funded the Australian Federal Police and state governments to the tune of $156 million for enforcement and compliance. Now on to housing. I would describe the changes in the housing space in this budget as small tweaks, but as I'll explain in the next slide, small tweaks are quite important if they're in the right place. So I've categorized the policies here by supply and demand. On the demand side are policies that impact buyers, And on the supply side are policies that impact the quantity of houses that come to market. So on the demand side, the settings on the Help to Buy shared equity scheme will be tweaked such that an expected $800 million additional will be provided to first home buyers, increasing demand. That's a small increase in that existing program. That's good for first home buyers. It's also good for homeowners and developers, as that boost in demand will help to boost house prices. Those price rises, however, are not so good if you don't own a home and you're not about to buy one. The opposite demand effect, though, is expected from the government's 2-year pause on foreign persons purchasing established dwellings. So that should reduce demand and take some pressure off the price of houses. On the supply side, the government is incentivising adoption of modern construction methods such as modular housing, while also working with the states to reduce red tape. They're working to design a national licensing scheme for electrical tradespeople to improve matching of workers to jobs, and that should improve productivity for that trade in the sector. And it will be good to see that hopefully rolled out to other trades as well. And they're doubling the incentive for completing a building industry apprenticeship from $5,000 to $10,000. Now, all of these supply side tweaks follow a report from the Productivity Commission earlier this month that described a steady decline in productivity in the construction sector. And most of these tweaks speak to those recommendations that were made in the report. So they are welcome to see. Now moving on to productivity more broadly. The Treasurer's speech described a transition from a younger population to an older one. And we've been hearing about this for some time. Productivity is going to be key for relatively fewer younger people to produce the goods and services that the population will demand in future and to avoid declining living standards. So what has this budget done for productivity? Let me preface this with a phrase that the Productivity Commissioner, the chair of the Productivity Commission likes to use. She says, productivity is a game of inches. You need a little tweak over here, a little tweak over there. We shouldn't get too excited about the big ticket items, but make sure we're making incrementally the right changes. So this should caution you to look for productivity in the budget in the detail. It's not necessarily those big ticket items with a B after them that is going to solve our productivity problems. And that feels a bit counterintuitive when you're looking at a federal budget. So what is in the detail? Well, I've already mentioned most of these, but I just wanted to point them out from this productivity perspective. Firstly, the construction industry policies I mentioned around modern manufacturing, reducing red tape, improving licensing and skills. I also mentioned the 50 new urgent care clinics that should reduce over-servicing patients with minor complaints. But another one that I'll point out is the ban on non-compete clauses for workers earning less than $175,000 per year. Now, similar to the national licensing scheme for electricians, this should work to grease the wheels in the labour market and better match people with the jobs that they'll be most productive in, and therefore improve productivity as a result. And I'd just like to finish with my favourite find in the budget. At the back of the shelf, tacked behind some tins of tuna, I've come across this $250 million to help the domestic low carbon liquid fuel industry. Now, this is important because decarbonising aircraft and maritime vessels, for example, is difficult because they're not so conducive to using electric motors like passenger vehicles are. However, renewable diesel is a low carbon solution that can run directly in existing diesel engines. So, for example, the engines that fishing boats use, you can just swap to using a low carbon fuel without having to upgrade the vessel. However, those fuels are expensive, so a domestic industry is needed to achieve a workable price point. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I love my seafood. I don't necessarily mean the tin tuna, but the fresh prawns and flathead and whiting and this sort of thing. So this funding gives me the selfish hope that I can continue to indulge myself in this fresh seafood guilt-free without worrying about the associated carbon emissions once we've established a domestic industry for producing these low carbon fuels. So that's all from me. I'll pass you over to Denise now to provide the corporate perspective.
Thanks, Anders. Well, I'm going to follow from Anders' last point and start off my presentation with my favourite find out of the budget. And this is what I've termed Panda Power. So for those of you who weren't aware, our newest pandas, Xingqi Yul and Yilun, arrived at Adelaide Zoo in Australia in January 2025. And for those of us who can remember back to 2009, we were absolutely in awe of the hysteria when Adelaide Zoo welcomed Wang Wang and Funi. We had Panda Cam and we had long waiting lists to visit the panda enclosure. So Australia's two new fluffy pandas are part of a collaborative agreement with China, under which they're on loan to Australia for less than 10 years, and it's part of promoting wildlife conservation and our international partnership with China. So in the budget on Tuesday night, the government announced a commitment of over $7.6 million over the 10 years that the pandas will be with us to support their care whilst they are here. Now, I did some calculations, and that's equivalent to about $15,000 per week as part of the cost of looking after our wonderful new pandas. And that's certainly more than the average Australian household budget. And I did some further calculations then regarding the cost of panda food as a supermarket comparative. And if a panda eats roughly 20 kilos of bamboo a day, then a kilo of bamboo costs around $50. And not even avocados are that expensive. So my question is, could Australia's love of pandas help the Australian government to win votes at the next upcoming election? I'm now going to move to my next slide. Thank you. Now, in the budget this year, there wasn't much in terms of technical content changes, but I did want to address just sort of three items, and I might call them my big ticket items, or the biggest ticket items we had from a corporate tax perspective. And the first one is in relation to R&D. And each year, as we sit down and prepare ourselves to listen to the Treasurer announce the budget, our R&D and government incentive teams eagerly await to hear whether or not there's any substantive changes to our R&D regime, whether it's good or it's bad. Now, in this year's budget, there were no changes announced to the R&D tax incentive regime. However, a proposal to exclude activities within the gaming and tobacco sectors was announced by the government in response to the negative press around the R&D program that it received following the release of the first R&D transparency report in October 2024. So the government released a statement saying that, yes, it was proposing to now exclude two industry sectors, being the gaming and tobacco sector, from future R&D claims as of the 1st of January 2025. It also made a subsequent statement to say that it would carve out of those exempted industries, or those no longer eligible industries, those activities where the gaming and tobacco sectors were undertaking R&D work focused solely on harm minimisation and the prevention of addiction. So the rationale for the industry exclusion, or the proposed industry exclusion we might call it, is that it aligns with the government's broader health objectives to minimise the adverse health and financial stress that the impact of gambling and tobacco has in our society. And it does set a concerning precedent for our R&D tax regime in regards to what's always been an industry agnostic program. It was interesting that there was no further reference to these proposed changes, which will require legislative amendment in the budget on Tuesday night. And we wonder whether the government is reconsidering its previous announcement, or at the very minimum, at least undertaking consultation with the relevant industry and stakeholder groups. So as we sit at the moment, it's unclear as to the status of these proposed changes ahead of the 1st of July 2025. As part of the budget, it's always good to have a look at sort of what the government is forecasting in terms of the economic impact of our R&D incentive regime over the forecast period. And it's also a good indication of the industry sectors where they're expecting to see growth, investment, and potentially the highest demand for our smartest and brightest people. And according to the budget papers on Tuesday night, the R&D growth sectors continue to be in mining, manufacturing, and the construction sectors. But interestingly, it also anticipates that there's likely to be a reduction in companies claiming the R&D incentive. And we wonder whether that's around a decline as a result of the increased cost versus the anticipated benefit of companies actually claiming the R&D concession, and whether it's also following on from some of the potential crackdowns on ineligible R activities through the ATO's ongoing compliance programs. So it's an interesting space if we do see some further progress in relation to excluding two industry sectors from being able to claim and participate in future R&D claims. And then just onto my next slide. Now, we always like to have a look at where is the government spending money in terms of the continuing ATO compliance programs. And on Tuesday night, the government committed to providing the ATO with a further $999.0 million to be provided over 4 years to the ATO to expand on their tax compliance capabilities. And for a moment, I thought I'd switch to an episode of The Gruen, and I wondered whether the funding commitment of $999.0 million appeared more palatable than a slightly rounded up commitment of $1 billion in its expenditure projections. Maybe it was just the cynic in me. And I just did want to touch on just the 4 key compliance programs that the ATO will be funding as a result of the government commitment. And the first one is about $718 million, and that's going to be applied to a 2-year expansion and a 1-year extension of the current tax avoidance task force. And the tax avoidance task force was created in 2016 with the aim to prevent, detect, and address tax avoidance amongst what is termed the largest and wealthiest taxpayers, and of course the multinational enterprises. The Australian Tax Office has noted that since the formation of that program in 2016, that the task force has actually raised about $23 billion and $16 billion in additional tax liabilities from public groups and multinationals and large private wealthy groups. The second program that they're looking at is in relation to our shadow economy compliance program. So again, it gets the sort of second highest allocation of expenditure. And this is a program focused on our shadow economy activities, including worker exploitation, underreporting of taxable income, and as mentioned it before, the illicit tobacco trade and other practices that effectively allow non-compliant businesses to gain an unfair competitive advantage over compliant and legitimate businesses in our economy. Thirdly, there's the personal and income tax compliance program, so about 76 million added to that. And then lastly, $50 million to extend the tax integrity program. And the tax integrity program is part of the ATO's efforts to engage with medium and large businesses and wealthy private groups to ensure timely compliance with tax and superannuation obligations. Now, the government will always look at what does it need to put in to fund these compliance activities and what is the likely payback or return on investment, I might call it, from the funding. And based on the government report papers, the projects are likely that they're looking to fund, these four ongoing compliance projects are likely to increase revenue by $3.2 billion over 5 years, and so returning investment in relation to that, I'm going to call it the $1 billion, of about $1.8 billion return to taxpayers. Additionally, the government anticipates that there'll be an increase of about $403 million in GST payments to the states and territories, along with about $31 million in unpaid superannuation to be distributed to employees. So, my last slide, what's missing? And I'm going to call it the elephant in the room. And Anders touched on this as well. It's tax reform, tax reform, tax reform. So, as an observation, the federal government, including the opposition Liberal Party, continue to avoid discussions in relation to real and substantial tax reform for corporate Australia. Our politicians really do seem to lack the willingness to be bold and embrace a long-term vision for our corporate tax system. We really do need substantive tax reform to improve Australia's economic position in increasing competitive, dynamic marketplace that we are participating in from a global perspective. And I acknowledge that in the last year, the government has enacted the OECD Global Pillar 2 tax reform legislation. And it's the first time in a long time that we've actually seen targeted legislation required to address the changing global and digitalised economy that we operate in. Although this new tax regime that's been enacted in Australia was, after all, the bold initiative of the OECD. So we've got an example of what bold can look like. And yes, Australia has embraced that, but it was really part of the OECD top-down introduction. So in an election year when the government positions itself to retain power, it's not surprising that the budget has really focused on measures that seek to win votes through tax cuts, cost of living measures, and improving our housing supply issues. They're all the day-to-day key issues that Australians face. So on Tuesday night, when the Treasurer said, and I quote, "The plan at the core of this budget is about more than putting the worst behind us. It's about seizing the best of what's ahead of us." And for a moment I thought, yes, Mr. Chalmers, substantive tax reform may well be on your horizon tonight. But alas. I'll go back to my first fun find. At least the budget ensured that our adorable pandas have the $7.6 million that they will need over the next 10 years so they won't have to worry about cost of living, providing housing for what we hope will be an expanding panda family, or the increasing supermarket price of fresh bamboo shoots. That's all from me. I'm going to pass over to James now for the personal tax update.
Thank you so much, Denise. I do hope those pandas find the bamboo fresh. I'm sure they will, with $7.6 million set aside for them. Now, regular listeners to this webinar will note that last year I had a bit of a complaint and I may have had a little bit of a rant. And that was to do with the fact that the Treasurer had taken all of the fun out of budget night last year. There were no surprises in the budget. Everything had been telegraphed well before budget night. And so there was nothing really interesting or exciting to deal with when we turned to the budget papers. The Treasurer has been listening to me. This year, he did keep some things up his sleeve. And the first one of those are income tax cuts. And I am sure it is because the Treasurer was listening to me, and it has nothing to do with this being an election year that we are seeing income tax come through. Although income tax cuts might be a little bit of a stretch, because really, is all the government doing giving back some of the taxes that it keeps taking from workers through tax bracket creep? Wages are increasing, and that naturally leads to an increase in taxes on those wages. And because typically our tax thresholds don't move, workers just end up paying more each year. So whilst we do put it under the heading of tax cuts, I'm not really sure it is a tax cut for everyone. But nevertheless, it is welcome to see that there will be a reduction in the tax rates at that first band. And so from the 1st of July 2026, not this year, next year, what we'll see is that that 16% rate will reduce to 15%, and that will put about another $268 in the pocket of those people who are earning more than that threshold. And also it will decrease to 14% the year after. And so that'll double it and put $536 of extra tax cuts into the pockets of workers. Nice, but I guess question whether that's going to really see an uptick in inflation pressures. I know Anders touched on that, and across the economy, it's a big number. But for individuals, $5, $10 a week is welcome, but perhaps doesn't change the dial too much. What we won't see, though, there won't be any change to the tax rates for foreign residents. Foreign residents start paying tax at 30%, so no change for them. And also for working holiday makers. So working holiday makers have a flat 15% rate, which applies on that income up to $45,000, and that won't change. So that will remain the same for them. So those are tax cuts for everyone, not particularly targeted. But where we do see targeted reform is more in relation to the Medicare levy threshold. And what we have here is an increase of the threshold at which taxpayers first start to pay the Medicare levy, and when the full Medicare levy of 2% sort of kicks in. And that's a welcome change. So that will see a particular benefit for low-income earners who will see a reduction in the amount of tax that they're having to pay. And that's backdated to the 1st of July 2024. So we'll see that flow through in the current financial year. And I should also mention, just in relation to this measure and more particularly in the income tax measures, that was passed by Parliament last night. So the Coalition didn't support it, but the government did get support from the crossbenchers. So that has gone through Parliament and was just waiting royal assent. So that is law. And if the Coalition isn't happy with that going forward, it is a little bit of political wedging. So they will need to then introduce legislation to take it away, which is always a little bit of a challenge for any government to try and increase taxes, particularly at that low income level. So we'll wait to see what happens there. There's a little bit to play out before we know for sure. So moving on to workers, what does this mean for individuals who are workers? What do we see in the budget that's coming out? Anders touched on the non-compete clauses, and what the government is proposing here is to impose a ban for all workers earning less than the high income threshold in the Fair Work Act, and that's currently $175,000. And that number doesn't include super, it doesn't include commissions and bonuses, so it's a base salary level. So a reasonable amount of earnings need to be were earned by the worker before they exceed that threshold, and therefore potentially could have non-compete clauses. And this was coming out of some of the reviews that the government had undertaken where they were identifying hairdressers, childcare workers, seeing non-compete clauses, and just taking the view that that really wasn't appropriate for income or workers earning below that high income threshold. So the government is going to do some consultation on those reforms. They aren't due to take effect until 2027. And I have seen some commentary already saying that, well, a lot of those clauses are perhaps coming off the back of off-the-shelf type of contracts that people are downloading from the internet. They aren't really being enforced. So whether there is a substantial change, I'm not quite sure, but it is helpful, and it potentially then will allow more movement of workers between employers and not being held by a non-compete clause and making it difficult for them to move jobs. We also see, as we have over the last few years, changes to apprentices, and that's the government putting more money into apprenticeships. It's an extension of existing programs as well as some new programs, and there's a particular focus on apprentices who are involved in residential housing, so skills for builders, electricians, plumbers and the like. And again, this comes back to what Anders was touching on, where we're looking at the housing crisis. And how can the government do that? It can put more money into those people who are involved in constructing the housing, and that will then hopefully see an increase in the housing supply, which will help the crisis that's arising in housing. So again, always welcome to see more money going into these types of programs. There were also a range of measures which touched on the cost of living allowance, and some of these have been picked up in a more broad macroeconomic perspective that Anders touched on, but looking down to what does it mean for individuals. Firstly, the electricity bill rebate. This rebate has been in place for a period of time. The government announced an extension, a 6 months extension. And what that means is that the rebate will be a maximum of $150, $75 for each quarter per household until the end of this calendar year. That rebate is paid directly to the energy retailers, so it's not an amount that goes into an individual's bank account, but it does help bring down the cost of electricity, which is one of the drivers of inflation. So there's a double benefit here, both in terms of helping cost of living pressures for individuals and small businesses, as well as trying to just take a little bit off the edge of inflation. Medicines and doctor visits. So the government announced that it will put more PBS medications into a bucket that will have scripts capped at $25 from the 1st of January 2026. And after this latest change, there'll be about 80% of PBS medications which are capped at $25 per script. So that's welcome in reducing the costs of medicines for people, particularly those people who are needing regular medications, and more money into the pocket of each of those individuals. There's also incentives for GPs to bulk bill, and the aim of government is by 2030 to have 90% of all GP visits bulk billed. And that's certainly an ambitious target, but by providing more incentives for GPs and through other sorts of programs to change the way people interact with the health system, that will hopefully see a reduction in the amount that it costs all of us to go and visit the doctor. Student debt. There was an announcement to cut the outstanding HECS or HELP debt for all outstanding debts by 20% by the 1st of June 2025. So that's before the next indexation is due to happen for those student debts. And that would be certainly welcome to students or former students who have this debt, but it's not going to put money into their pocket straight away because that debt is still there and still needs to be paid off. And so to help with that, there'd been some previously announced changes to increase the repayment income threshold to $67,000. So what that means is that there's a higher income threshold before those students or former students need to start repaying that debt. So that will put more money directly into the pocket of students. So something positive for those students and former students with HECS debts. Now, my little takeaway from the budget that I was excited to hear about, and what's a budget without commentary around beer and cigarettes? And we've already heard about cigarettes, but beer. What we face every 6 months is this sad moment when we rock up to the bar and we find the price of our schooner or pot or middy has increased. And that happens twice a year because the government increases the excise on beer, and that then flows through straight to the drinker. Now, the government has proposed that it will pause the indexation of the draft beer excise for the next 2 years. So in August of this year, when you would otherwise expect to see a rise in the price of your beer, you won't see it. So that's a good thing. More money in your pocket. So when Anders is having his fresh seafood, his prawns, his whiting, his flathead, he can enjoy it with a nice schooner, and that won't cost as much as what it might otherwise have been if that had not been changed. So thank you, Dr. Chalmers, for that. Childcare education. The government announced that it is looking to expand the number of our little young ones who are going to get early childhood care education. And it's doing this by wanting to guarantee for families 3 days a week of subsidised early childhood education. And that's provided you don't exceed a fairly high income cap. And the idea here is to get universal early childhood education. So more children being educated, being ready then to roll into schools following that early formative years. They'll also remove the childcare subsidy activity test. So the subsidy test used to be that you had to have a certain amount of work or study being undertaken in order to get that subsidised childcare. That will no longer be the case. So that's certainly welcome for families to have that support. And whilst they are taking away the activity test, it still is a measure that's targeted at encouraging female participation in the workforce by providing more support for families and allowing more females to participate in the workforce going forward. Denise touched on some of the tax integrity measures which the government announced, and these are all around increasing funding for the ATO. And for individuals, the particular focus or particularly relevant programs are the Personal Income Tax Compliant Program, where there's another 75 million that's going to be available over 4 years to expand on proactive, preventative and corrective activities. I read more audits in that program. So there certainly will be more of a focus on from the ATO onto individuals to ensure that they are complying with their obligations. And these are increasingly complex obligations. So we also hope that the ATO spends some of that money towards education and information and guidance for taxpayers, particularly individual taxpayers, so that they can comply with the laws that are particularly complex for them. For individuals who are working and receiving superannuation contributions and having tax withheld by employers, there's a tax integrity program which is targeting medium and large businesses to ensure that there is a timely deduction and remission of those sorts of taxes and superannuation liabilities. That will also be helped by the proposed measures to move towards payday superannuation, which is due to start on the 1st of July 2026. And we've seen some draft legislation just recently come out about that. So those sorts of measures will help to ensure that employers are complying with their obligations and workers are seeing their superannuation entitlements arrive in their super fund on time and perhaps more quickly than what it has in the past. The ATO will also be given some money to monitor and enforce bans on foreign persons, including temporary residents, from purchasing established dwellings. And this is just a continuation of some of the government measures that we've seen more recently, which is really trying to discourage foreigners from purchasing particularly residential properties. And we've seen changes to the CGT discount being denied for foreign residents. And we've also seen the states imposing a range of levies and charges on foreigners who are owning property in Australia, looking to try and expand the supply of housing that's available for Australians to live in. Finally, just touching on superannuation, and I know it was mentioned up front that we didn't see any significant changes to superannuation in the budget, but it just is worth mentioning that the large or proposed change to introduce Division 296, which is the additional tax on earnings and, importantly, unrealised gains, which is attributable to part of an individual superannuation balance that exceeds $3 million. That is legislation that's before Parliament. It's been looked at by a Senate committee, and the Coalition and the crossbenchers haven't supported the government on that proposed change. So that's unlikely to find its way through Parliament before the election is called, and in that case, that legislation will lapse. And then we wait to see what happens as a result of the election, because the government has continued to say it is keen to reintroduce that legislation or see that legislation come through, whereas obviously the Coalition is not supportive of that. So we wait to see with bated breath where we end up with on superannuation and those particular changes. Well, that covers everything that I wanted to go through for individuals, employers and workers. So thank you very much for your time, and I hand back to Leisa.
So this was a typical pre-election budget that set the scene for the commencement of the government's election campaign. Despite the short-term financial support and cost of living relief measures, really the long-term economic and tax strategy were missing. We will await Peter Dutton's formal response this evening. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panellists, Anders, Denise and James. They did an excellent job at unpacking this year's budget, also keeping it interesting for you all with references to seafood, pandas and beer. Before we wrap up, we'd love your feedback, and you'll have an opportunity to provide us with your thoughts after the webinar closes. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us. And don't forget to check out our federal budget analysis. It's available out on our website now. Thank you and have a good day.